A cold breeze swept through the quiet suburban neighborhood. As Rachel adjusted her scarf and stepped out of her house, it was a Saturday morning, the one day she usually set aside to catch up on errands or simply unwind. But today, she had different plans. She glanced at the house across the street, Mrs. Jenkins's home. The elderly woman had been living there for as long as Rachel could remember, alone. Rachel had often seen her sitting by the window, watching the world go by. Sometimes, she'd wave. Other times, her eyes held a quiet sadness that lingered even after she turned away. Lately, Rachel had noticed the overgrown hedges, the dusty windows, the stack of newspapers piling up by the door. It wasn't hard to tell that Mrs. Jenkins was struggling to keep up with things. Maybe she had no one to help her. Maybe no one had even asked. Rachel took a deep breath and crossed the street. She knocked gently. At first, there was no response. Just as she was about to knock again, the door creaked open slightly. Mrs. Jenkins peered out, her frail frame barely visible in the dimly lit house. "Rachel, dear," the old woman said, her voice soft but surprised. "Is something wrong?" Rachel shook her head. "No, not at all. She hesitated, not wanting to offend. "I was wondering if I could help you with anything today. Maybe tidy up a little." Mrs. Jenkins blinked, as if unsure she had heard correctly. Then she chuckled, a quiet, almost disbelieving sound. "Oh, sweetheart, that's very kind of you. But you don't have to trouble yourself." "It's no trouble," Rachel said quickly. "Honestly, I'd love to help. I have the whole day free." For a moment, Mrs. Jenkins just stared at her. Then with a tired sigh, she stepped back and opened the door wider. "Well, if you really don't mind." Rachel followed her inside and was immediately met with the stale scent of dust and time. The house wasn't filthy, but it was cluttered. Papers stacked on tables, old furniture covered in a thin layer of dust, dishes sitting in the sink as if waiting for someone who never came. "I used to keep this place spotless," Mrs. Jenkins murmured, almost to herself. "But lately, I just don't have the energy." Rachel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "That's why I'm here." She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She started in the living room, dusting off surfaces and carefully stacking books that had been scattered around. Mrs. Jenkins sat nearby, watching with an expression that was hard to read, somewhere between gratitude and disbelief. As Rachel moved to the kitchen, she noticed a collection of old photos pinned to the fridge. A younger Mrs. Jenkins, smiling beside a man who must have been her husband. A baby in her arms. Another photo showed a boy, maybe 10 years old, grinning at the camera. Rachel glanced at the elderly woman, wanting to ask, but not wanting to pry. Instead, she simply said, "You have a beautiful family." Mrs. Jenkins's lips pressed together for a moment. "Had," she corrected softly. Rachel felt a pang of regret for bringing it up, but Mrs. Jenkins didn't seem upset, just lost in thought. By the time Rachel finished cleaning the kitchen and moved on to the bathroom, the hours had slipped by. She hadn't realized how much work needed to be done, but as she scrubbed the sink, wiped down mirrors, and mopped floors, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't expected. When she finally emerged, she found Mrs. Jenkins dozing off on the couch. Rachel smiled and draped a blanket over her shoulders before returning to the last task, sorting through a pile of unopened mail, bills, advertisements, and a few letters. She set them neatly on the coffee table and was about to step away when something caught her eye, an envelope, slightly different from the rest. It was old, the paper yellowed at the edges, and the name on it wasn't Mrs. Jenkins. It was addressed to someone else, someone Rachel didn't recognize. Her fingers hovered over it, curiosity gnawing at her. Had it been misplaced? Forgotten? The handwriting on the front looked familiar, though she couldn't quite place why. Just as she was about to call out to Mrs. Jenkins, the old woman stirred. She blinked, looking around, as if momentarily unsure of where she was. Then her eyes landed on the tidy room, the clean floors, the dust-free shelves. "Oh, Rachel," she whispered. "I don't know how to thank you." Rachel smiled. "You don't have to. I'm just glad I could help." Mrs. Jenkins' gaze softened. "Not many people would do what you did today. It means more than you know." Rachel was about to respond when she remembered the envelope. She hesitated, then held it up. "I found this while sorting the mail. It looks important." The moment Mrs. Jenkins saw it, her entire expression changed. Her face paled, and her hands trembled as she reached for it. Where did you find this?" Rachel frowned. "It was mixed in with the other mail. Is everything okay?" Mrs. Jenkins' fingers traced the edges of the envelope, her breath coming faster. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "This letter. I thought it was lost forever." Rachel felt a strange shiver run through her. "What is it?" Mrs. Jenkins swallowed hard, gripping the letter as if afraid it might disappear. Her voice wavered. "It's from someone I never thought I'd hear from again." Rachel stared at her, heart pounding. She had spent the day simply wanting to help, but now, standing there in that quiet living room, she realized she had stumbled onto something much bigger, something that had been waiting for years to be uncovered. Rachel watched as Mrs. Jenkins's frail fingers trembled over the old envelope, her expression a mix of disbelief and deep emotion. It was as if time had suddenly stopped for her. The air in the room felt heavier, filled with unspoken words and memories that had been locked away for far too long. Rachel hesitated before sitting down beside her. "Mrs. Jenkins, who is it from?" she asked gently. The elderly woman exhaled shakily, gripping the envelope tightly. "It's from my son," she whispered. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She had seen the old photographs on the fridge earlier. A young boy with a bright smile, but Mrs. Jenkins had spoken in past tense when referring to her family. Had she lost him, or had something else happened? "I thought I'd never see this again," Mrs. Jenkins continued, her voice barely above a breath. "I thought it was gone, just like him." Rachel leaned in. "Gone? What do you mean?" For a moment, Mrs. Jenkins seemed lost in the weight of her own memories. Then, with a sigh, she set the envelope down on the coffee table, her eyes fixed on it as if she were afraid of what it might contain. "My son Daniel. He left home almost 20 years ago," she said, her voice laced with sorrow. "He was so young, full of fire, full of dreams. But we didn't part on good terms." Rachel stayed silent, giving her space to continue. Mrs. Jenkins's eyes glistened as she stared at the envelope. "He wanted to travel, to explore the world. He had this idea that life was waiting for him somewhere beyond this town. But I was afraid. I begged him to stay, told him it was foolish to chase something so uncertain. We argued. I said things I never should have said." A deep sigh escaped her lips. And then, one day, he was gone. Just like that. No goodbye, no forwarding address. I searched. I wrote letters. I called old friends. But he never reached out. Not once. Rachel felt a lump form in her throat. "You never heard from him? Again?" Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. "For years, I kept hoping. Every knock on the door, every unknown number on the phone. I thought maybe, just maybe, it would be him. But it never was. Eventually, I had to accept that he wasn't coming back. Rachel glanced at the envelope. And this letter, how long has it been sitting here? Mrs. Jenkins wiped her eyes, thinking. It must have arrived years ago. It must have gotten lost in the pile of mail. Or maybe I just stopped looking after a while. Rachel's chest tightened at the thought. A letter that had been waiting for her all these years, hidden in plain sight. What if he was trying to reach out? Rachel asked softly. What if he wanted to come home? Mrs. Jenkins inhaled sharply, as if the thought had never truly occurred to her. Her fingers moved to the edge of the envelope, hesitating, almost afraid to open it. What if it's too late? She murmured. Rachel placed a comforting hand on hers. You won't know until you read it. Mrs. Jenkins sat still for a long moment. Then with a deep breath, she carefully peeled open the envelope, her hand shaking as she unfolded the letter inside. Rachel watched as the old woman's eyes scanned the page, flickering with emotions that shifted from shock to sadness, and then something even deeper, regret. Tears slid down Mrs. Jenkins's cheeks. Her breath hitched, and she clutched the letter to her chest. Oh, Daniel, she whispered. Rachel's heart pounded. What does it say? Mrs. Jenkins wiped her tears and read aloud, her voice thick with emotion. Dear Mom, I don't know if you'll ever see this letter, but I have to write it anyway. I've spent years carrying the weight of our last conversation, and I want you to know that I never stopped thinking about you. I never stopped missing home. I've been all over, places I only ever dreamed of when I was a kid. I've seen the world, met wonderful people, but something has always been missing. No matter where I go, I always find myself thinking about Sunday mornings in our little house, about the smell of your cooking, about the way you used to hum to yourself while washing dishes. I was stubborn. I wanted to prove I could make it on my own. But what I didn't realize then was that home isn't something you run away from. It's something that stays with you, no matter where you go. I want to come back, Mom. If you'll have me, if there's still a place for me, I'll be in town next week, staying at the old inn near the square. I don't know if you'll want to see me, but if you do, I'll be there, waiting. Love, Daniel. Mrs. Jenkins's voice broke as she finished. Her hands gripped the letter so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Rachel felt her own eyes sting with tears. Mrs. Jenkins, she whispered. The old woman shook her head, pain flashing across her face. He came back, she said, her voice barely audible. He was here, and I never knew. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The letter had been sitting here for years. If Daniel had come to town, and she never responded. What had happened? A heavy silence filled the room. Mrs. Jenkins clutched her chest, her breathing uneven. I failed him, she whispered. I failed my own son. Rachel quickly reached for her hand. No, you didn't know. Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. But I should have. I should have kept looking. I should have never given up. Rachel's mind raced. If Daniel had truly come back, there had to be a way to find out what had happened to him. There had to be someone in town who remembered. Him. Someone who could give Mrs. Jenkins the answers she had been missing all these years. Rachel squeezed the old woman's hand. It's not too late, she said firmly. We can find out what happened. Mrs. Jenkins looked up, her eyes filled with fear and hope all at once. But what if he's gone for good? Rachel took a deep breath, determination settling in her chest. Then we'll find a way to make sure he knows that he was never forgotten. Mrs. Jenkins wiped her tears, staring at the letter as if it held all the missing pieces of her heart. And for the first time in years, she had a reason to hope again. But as Rachel sat beside her, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. Something was still unfinished, something that could change everything. Rachel didn't waste any time. The moment she left Mrs. Jenkins's house, she was determined to find out what had happened to Daniel. If he had come back all those years ago, someone in town had to remember him. Someone had to know where he went. She started at the old inn, near the square, the place Daniel had mentioned in his letter. The building had changed hands over the years, but when she spoke to the current owner, an elderly man named Mr. Thompson, his face lit up with recognition at the name, Daniel Jenkins. Yes, I remember him, Mr. Thompson said, rubbing his chin. Young man checked in here maybe 15, 16 years ago. He didn't stay long, just a few days. Rachel's pulse quickened. Do you remember if he tried to contact anyone? His mother, Mr. Thompson sighed. That I don't know. He kept to himself mostly, but I do remember one thing. He asked about the old house on Maple Street. Said he used to live there. Rachel's heart sank. That was Mrs. Jenkins's house. He had come back. He had stood so close to home, waiting, hoping, and she had never known. Do you know where he went after that? Rachel asked, her voice almost pleading. Mr. Thompson hesitated, then nodded. Last I saw him, he was talking to an old friend of his. That guy. I think his name was Paul. They were sitting right over there on that bench. I remember because I heard Daniel say, I just want to see her one last time. Rachel's breath hitched. He had been waiting for Mrs. Jenkins. After thanking Mr. Thompson, Rachel found Paul's number through an old friend and called him. To her relief, he answered and agreed to meet. When she sat across from Paul at a small cafe, she could see the recognition in his eyes when she mentioned Daniel. His face grew somber. I wondered if someone would ever ask about him, Paul said, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. Daniel was like a brother to me. When he came back, he was different, quieter. He told me about the letter he had sent. His mom said he was afraid she might not want to see him, but he hoped she would. Rachel swallowed hard. Did she ever get the chance? Paul shook his head. No. He waited at the inn for days. Every morning he'd walk to Maple Street, just stand at a distance, looking at the house. I told him to knock, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. He said if she didn't answer the letter, maybe she didn't want to see him. Rachel felt her chest tighten. If only Mrs. Jenkins had known. Paul continued, his voice softer now. On his last day in town, we sat by the river. He told me he was going to try one last time. If she didn't come, he'd leave and never look back. Rachel leaned in. And? What happened? Paul sighed. He waited there all afternoon. I had to leave for work, but when I came back that evening, he was gone. Rachel's heart sank. Gone where? Paul hesitated, then reached into his wallet, pulling out an old, slightly crumpled newspaper clipping. A few days later, I read this.